So let's say you found the skeleton. How would you tell people that it's you personally? How would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on this.
Hey there, YouTube. It's the Dapper Dinosaur here, and it is 2:47 a.m. right now. I have no idea why I'm awake, but I've got some aches, and I feel like I might be coming down with something, so I'm currently making some lemon ginger tea, and I figured, hey, this creationist nonsense out there, if I'm going to be up, I might as well be countering some of it. So I'm now going to take a look at the video, What the Hex is Evolution? From A Bit of Orange. A Bit of Orange is a fairly small channel, but they have some fairly decent production quality videos. Some of them are actually kind of entertaining. I have not watched this, so this is going to be a more or less live react.
Welcome to the Sin Hound Show.
Thanks, and welcome to Dapper Dinosaur, I guess.
What we are talking about today, we are continuing our conversation about evolution, because evolution is a very popular cult.
Religion, noun. The belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially of a personal god or gods. A particular system of faith and worship. Pursuit or interest to which someone ascribes supreme importance. Evolution doesn't really seem to meet any of those. It could meet the third one, but then I don't know too many people for whom it's actually really that important to their lives. Most people who accept evolution accept it the same way that, say, you accept universal gravitation. It's just a thing that's true. Time to move on with our lives.
I don't have a shoulder angel on the other side. That's just creepy. So before you have a debate about anything, before you fight about anything, define your terms, children. You have to know what it is you are talking about. So is evolution a fact or is it a lie? It depends on how you define it. So the way I have defined it is I am telling the full story here. Not everybody does. So let me explain some of the common ways that this works out. So is evolution change over time? I got a textbook on the shelf there. It's just the title of the book is Evolution, Change Over Time.
Well, change over time is a pretty reasonable colloquial definition for evolution. It's not really the scientific definition when you get into biology, and I'm sure that textbook on your wall is just using that definition as an evocative phrase to get people to read the textbook. I bet in the textbook, it defines biological evolution more exactly.
Is it descent with modification? I got a comment on Facebook this week telling me evolution is just descent with modification. Changes in allele frequency. A very popular one on the internet is that evolution is, by definition, changes in allele frequency. Or it's any change in genetics from one generation to the next. Again, earlier this week, got that on Facebook. Are you starting to see that there isn't one single agreed upon universal definition for evolution? It depends who you talk to.
Those are all the same definition. The fact that you don't understand that definition just shows that maybe this isn't something that you should be talking about. Maybe you should be learning about it. But hey, let's see what else you got.
Some people will say evolution is natural selection, or they'll say natural selection is evolution. Microevolution over time, things change or evolve over time. There is a laundry list.
Those aren't definitions of evolution. Those are aspects of it. Sort of like saying falling is gravity. Well, it's not the entirety of gravity. There's also things like orbiting. But falling is a result of gravity, and it's part of the theory of universal gravitation. So if you're being informal and loose with language, it's not really wrong to say that falling is gravity. Similarly, it's not really wrong to say natural selection is evolution because it's a significant part of evolutionary theory. It's a bit sloppy, but that's all.
Now the problem, as I will point out, is that these aren't real good at telling the story. You have to remember what the story is. The story is the Darwinian tree of life. So as you can see here, we start off in the distant past with no life at all. Where did life come from? We're going to figure that out. You have to have faith in science, children. You have to have faith that someday, what seems to be impossible according to every science we know and even basic mathematics, will someday be proven to be a historical fact. That life made itself. So that...
Well, no. The story of evolution doesn't include the story of the origin of life because that would have arisen by non-evolutionary processes because evolution requires reproducing entities in order to function. so before that, it couldn't have functioned. And if life were simply placed here by God, then that doesn't do anything to negate or in any way take away from the theory of evolution. That's a matter for abiogenesis. It means that the method of abiogenesis was supernatural. But that doesn't change anything about the history of evolution on Earth. As it turns out, not every aspect of science that disagrees with your interpretation of your religion is dependent on each other. Scientists don't think of it that way because that's not how it is. You should stop thinking about it that way.
You start off with no life at all. You have just rocks and water and chemical. It's like soup, but not made from chicken or noodles. It's just soup. The soup builds a cell, and it's got all of the structures and functions in order to survive. So it's got some kind of membrane, some kind of porous membrane with functions and structures to allow the passage of chemicals in and out, but a controlled structure so that the passage of chemicals are necessary chemicals in and toxic chemicals out. Otherwise, it chokes to death on its own toots. You got to have the ability to process whatever food it eats so that you are metabolizing to create the energy to run the cell. You have to have something to read the genetic information, whether that's DNA or RNA, and coded for in the DNA or RNA is all of the information to create the protein structures for all of the machines that run the cell, that build the cell, and also to replicate the cell.
Well, unfortunately for you, all of these things are things that are known to happen naturally on their own. Phospholipid bilayers will turn into hypercycles fairly easily once a phospholipid actually exists, because that's the lowest energy state for phospholipids to take in a watery solution. RNA can spontaneously assemble in certain circumstances which are known to be plausible, and RNA can catalyze its own reproduction as well as protein synthesis from amino acids, which are also known to form naturally. Now, it's not known exactly how all of these things interact or how they likely interacted during the initial creation of life on Earth, but the fact is that none of these things that you just mentioned are actually impossible according to the laws of physics or anything else. They've all been observed to happen in natural or natural-like settings.
And remember, all of that and more has to happen in that very first cell without any guidance or direction at all. And think about the size of the Earth. Think about the size of a bacteria. Think about the size of a drop of water. Not only does it have to all happen in the same drop of water, it has to happen in the same neighborhood of drop of water. Because bacteria are so small that to a bacteria, one of your cells is like a whole neighborhood with lots of different districts. They're tremendously tiny. So all of those different parts and pieces have to come about spontaneously just through chemistry and assemble themselves.
Well, conveniently, they can and do that.
But we're not here to talk about the origins. We're here to talk about what happens next. So we're going to pretend that all that happened. That, sure, improbable, but it only had to happen once. So the evolutionary story is once you have that life, however it happened, we don't know, but we have faith that it happened.
Look, it obviously happened. Even creationists agree that at some point in the universe's history there was no life, and that at a later point in time there was life. This isn't something that is particular to evolution, the belief that life came into existence at a certain point of time.
Somehow bacteria, over time, produced worms.
Well, probably not in the way that you're thinking. The last universal common ancestor, which probably was the ancestor of what you normally think of as bacteria, like Escherichia coli or Streptococcus, and eukaryotes, like, say, plants and animals, probably wasn't really much like a prokaryote or like a eukaryote. Probably didn't have a cell wall. It's not clear how its DNA was arranged, but it really wasn't a bacterium.
Because for like 2 billion years, the Earth was just like an unbrushed tooth. Just a whole bunch of hard enamel covered in plaque. And that was it. No worms, no fish, no lizards, nothing but bacteria. And somehow, something happened wherein multicellular worms and other multicellular creatures just exploded onto the scene. It's called the Cambrian explosion.
No. Multicellularity arose well before the Cambrian period, as you can see in things like the Ediacaran biota, which includes such multicellular forms as Charnia, Charnia discus, and triploblasts, an entire phylum of animals, well, presumably animals, that went extinct before the Cambrian. It's actually not that hard to get multicellularity out of single-celled organisms. It's been done in laboratories in real time. The basic distinction between a group of clonal cells that are a colony of single cells and a multicellular organism is essentially tissue differentiation. Once you have different kinds of cells, such as, say, somatic and reproductive cells, you have multicellularity. In fact, you don't even need to group these cells into tissues, which is why sponges, despite not really having tissues, are multicellular because they have differentiated cell types.
Boom. And then somehow, in a world with just worms and no fish, somehow fish came into being. And evolution is supposed to be how worms would over time turn into fish.
Maybe I'm being insufficiently charitable, but it seems like you're trying to imply that something like an earthworm or a polychaete worm is simply going to give birth to a fish at some point. Or perhaps, I guess, lay an egg that hatches into a fish. And by fish, you seem to mean things like, a modern carp or a tuna or something. But on screen right now is a fossil of one of the earliest known things that could be reasonably called a fish. And here it's important to point out that the word fish in science essentially has no meaning, because basically it just means chordate that isn't a tetrapod. But this animal is definitely a chordate, but you'll also notice that it's basically a worm. It's hard to make out, but it even has little sensory stalks like a snail. This is Picaia. Picaia is basically just a long set of chevron-shaped muscles that are segmented going anterior-dorsally. These segmented muscles allow the animal to move in an anguilliform swimming motion, which means it undulates its entire body to move through the water column. It has a bit of a flattened tail at the end, the posterior end, which is sort of like a fish tail. But yeah, this is a chordate and it's not a tetrapod, so by most reasonable definitions of fish, this is a fish, and yet it's also basically a worm. It's almost as if it were some kind of a transition between what you might call a worm and what you might call a fish.
I have a very, very daffy skeptic on the internet telling me nobody in the world is saying the worms turn into fish. That's a straw man. That's a lie. You're a liar, 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 pants on fire. Her name is Deb. And when you ask Deb, okay, if it is a lie that worms turn into fish according to evolutionary theory, now I don't think it's true, but it's what evolution teaches. She's an evolutionist. And she's saying it is a lie that I presented that worms evolved into fish. And I said, all right, if that's a lie, then where did fish come from? And of course, she doesn't have an answer to that, because when there's nothing on Earth but bacteria and worms, and then fish come into being, there's only so many options, Deb.
Part of the problem here is that the word worm, again, kind of like the word fish, doesn't really mean anything. It sort of means something that's longer than it is thick, it can move around, and usually it involves segmentation, but it doesn't always, like flatworms aren't segmented. So it's kind of useless to say that, anything evolved from a worm, because, again, worm doesn't mean much. However, it is definitely true that no modern worms are the ancestors to, say, modern fish, or even that any of the things that we would call worms are terribly closely related to those things. It's just that at the time that fish were evolving from other deuterostomes, well, worm could broadly describe a lot of things because it's a very simple body shape. So Deb is correct in saying that nothing that we would currently call a worm evolved into a fish, and you're kind of correct in saying that things that we probably would have looked at and said were worms were in fact the things that gave rise to fish. So it's more like you're being unclear.
Where was I? All right, so worms turn into fish, and then fish turn into lizards. And this is the process that explains how everything came to be. But the purpose of evolution is not to ambiguously say, hey, things happen, things change, but a specific kind of change that will turn worms into fish and fish into lizards and lizards into whatever else comes next. So that is what we need to keep in mind when we are asking ourselves, what is evolution? Now here's the creationary orchard. The creation orchard differs significantly because these are not connected.
No, they're not connected, but I've never heard a good reason as to why they can't be. What is it that allows you to draw a phylogenetic tree within certain groups, but then say that the phylogenetic analysis that you use to create that tree, which works just as well when used with a bigger set of animals or plants or any organisms, stops functioning? Because you can use as big a set of organisms as you want, and you'll be able to create a phylogenetic tree.
This is the dog tree. It is a series of unique, distinct trees. So up at the top of the tree here, the trees The orchard is a series of distinct trees, my sinners and saints. Where in the dog tree, at the top of the tree, up here at the top, today, we have 400 varieties of pet shop dogs that can be bought all over the world, and a whole lot of dogs living out in nature, out in, uncivilized areas like Detroit. So, all of those dogs, because they are all dogs, can be traced to a common ancestor, or common ancestors.
Okay, that's all the dogs. But what about, say, amphicyonids? Or ursids? Or pinnipeds? I mean, ursids and pinnipeds are in Arctoidea, so I guess they're both kind of Arctoidean, so they have a common ancestor. But ursids, pinnipeds, dogs, and amphicyonids are all caniforms, so I guess they have a caniform ancestor. But all of the caniforms are carnivorans along with the felloforms like civets and cats and hyenas, so I guess they have a carnivoran ancestor. But then the carnivores are ferens along with the pangolins, so I guess they have a feran ancestor. But then all of those are ferungulates along with the ungulates like horses and cows, so I guess they have a ferungulatan ancestor. And we can keep on going all the way back to just life. Why do you cut it off? You have to justify this. You can't just say, well, they're all dogs, so they all have a dog common ancestor.
The pair of dogs that were brought by Noah on the ark during the flood. That's what this blue line is at the bottom of all these trees. That is the genetic bottleneck where whatever variation did exist in the population, it doesn't exist anymore because Noah took a pair of every kind, not two of every variety.
I would like to introduce you to Acinonyx jubatus, also known as the cheetah. Cheetahs have an unusually low genetic diversity. In fact, it's so low that a cheetah will not reject a skin graft from any other cheetah. It doesn't even have to be a sibling or a parent. Any unrelated cheetah can accept a skin graft from any other cheetah. That's a ridiculously low amount of genetic diversity. In fact, the average cheetah is as related genetically to any other cheetah as human siblings tend to be, and humans already have a pretty low genetic diversity when it comes to modern animals. Cheetahs have such a low genetic diversity that it's pretty well confirmed that they had a genetic bottleneck some 12,000 years ago, which left them with perhaps fewer than 100 individuals in the entire population. But we're going to go ahead and say that nope, all modern canines and felines actually descended from two examples of each groups 4,000 years ago. That's simply absurd. There is absolutely no way to recover that kind of genetic diversity in 4,000 years.
Two of every kind, so two of the dog kind on the ark.
Until you come up with a technique that will allow us to take any group of organisms and divide them into kinds unambiguously and in a way that is objectively verifiable, the word kind just isn't useful here. It literally only exists in creationist discourse to facilitate the fallacy of equivocation, where you get to just make up a new definition of kind for whatever happens to suit your needs at the time. Humans, a single species, can be a kind. Bacteria, an entire kingdom, can be a kind. Apes, a family which includes humans, can be a different kind from humans who are already included in the family. It's just a weasel word. It doesn't mean anything.
So at the top of the tree, you got 400 varieties of pet shop dog and the wild dogs of today that all came from this common ancestor that was on the ark.
Well, unless Noah's flood happened something like 40 million years ago, I'm sorry, but no, there just isn't enough time for you to get that much variety in life out of just a single pair of organisms roughly at the family level.
I had a person on Facebook this week show me this image and say, well, if you believe this, the creation orchard, then the fact that there are no transitional forms in the fossils is a problem for you. In fact, it's a bigger problem for you than it is for us evolutionists. He was really making this point. Pardon me. I gotta wash that down with some Arnold Palmer. So here's the thing. I had put up an article showing that it is a recognized fact of paleontology that the innumerable transitional forms that go from fish to lizard, from lizard to mammal, and et cetera, all these different transitional forms are missing.
Well, I don't know who that woman is, and so I can't comment on her argument. It doesn't sound like a particularly great argument to me. I'm not sure how many fossils we should expect in a 4,000 year period showing transitions, even if such transitions were possible in such a short time frame. But without her around to defend her argument, I don't really want to address it. However, as for your article saying that it's an admitted fact that all of these transitions aren't in the fossil record, I would like a citation, but your video description doesn't give one. On the other hand, fossil transitions between, say, primitive amniotes and synapsids, which later gave rise to mammals which are still synapsids, yeah, that's pretty prevalent, as well as all of the other transitions that you used, as long as we realize how poorly you're using terms like lizard. Lizards are a particular group of diapsids, so they're amniotes, they're sauropsids, they're diapsids, they're lepidosaurs, they're squamates, and specifically, they're lizards. Lizards are not the ancestors of mammals or dinosaurs or birds. If you want to argue against evolution, it helps to actually know what you're talking about and what evolution says, and also to not just lie about paleontology, as if paleontologists don't have transitional forms, which they manifestly do. Just check Wikipedia, it has a list of hundreds.
That's why it's called the missing link, because it does not exist. There is no evidence. We have 1 billion fossils dug out of the earth in museums all over the world, but no transitional forms between the kinds. We explain that by saying there weren't any transitions. Dogs have always been dogs. Fish have always been fish. Lizards have always been lizards. There was never a lizard fish or a turtle dog or anything like that.
Well, they aren't really called missing links by anyone except creationists because so many transitional forms have been found. That's why we now just call them transitional forms, and they're all over the place. But no, we haven't found a fish lizard or a turtle dog because, well, we wouldn't expect to. Because primitive tetrapods is what evolved from fish-grade sarcopterygians, and they weren't lizards, and they wouldn't be lizards for quite a while. In fact, the common ancestor of dogs, turtles, and lizards was such a creature. And turtles are nowhere near dogs, evolutionarily speaking. I'm sorry that we haven't found things that would disprove evolution if found, because apparently to you that would prove evolution?
And this atheist, a man who writes great long diatribes about how stupid creationists are,
Just want to point out, you don't have to be an atheist to notice how stupid creationism is.
put up in response to this article that if you dumb creationists believe this creation orchard stuff, then the fact that there's no transitions in the fossils is a bigger problem for you than it is for us.
Like I said, probably not an argument that I would use. I don't think it's particularly good, but I don't want to comment on it too much because the person who made it isn't here.
Essentially, what it comes down to is a lot of skeptics essentially will use a great many words to communicate, I don't understand your position, but it's wrong and I hate you.
You know, I'm just going to read something from the Encyclopedia Britannica about projection. Projection is a form of defense in which unwanted feelings are displaced onto another person, where they then appear as a threat from the external world. A common form of projection occurs when an individual, threatened by his own angry feelings, accuses another of harboring hostile thoughts.
Anyway, there are no transitional forms because nothing transitioned from one kind.
Well, since no creationist has ever actually given anyone any objective and verifiable way to tell if any two organisms are in a different kind, saying that one kind never transitioned into another kind is kind of useless. Plus, in evolutionary biology, things don't really transition from one category to another. New categories erupt from within older categories, which remain.
To another. Now, you want to find a transitional form from one kind of dog, or one variety of dog, into another variety of dog. Go to the pet store. All you got to do is find another dog. I have friends who had a dog that was half beagle, half chihuahua. You want to find the transitional form for that dog? I think that dog is a transitional form. I think he's like they made one. They made a transition from beagle to chihuahua. I don't know.
So do you remember when you said,
I don't understand your position, but it's wrong and I hate you?
Yeah, there's a reason that I read that little article on projection. So you entirely misunderstand what a transitional form in evolution is. It's not a transition between any two modern forms, like a turtle and a dog that you mentioned earlier. Instead, it's a transition between more primitive forms and more derived forms. So for instance, the transition between more primitive sauropsids and turtles doesn't quite have a full carapace. But there are examples of animals with thickened ribs, animals with thickened ribs and a plastron, animals with thickened ribs and a plastron where the shoulder girdle is starting to go inside the ribs, and animals with a thickened rib structure that actually forms a shell and a plastron. That's the kind of transition we would see. But none of these things is a half turtle, half lizard, or a half turtle, half dog, because that would disprove evolution. You should be hoping that we find such a transition.
That's a funny dog. I'll give him that. Anyway, so the creation orchard has dogs as a distinct created kind with all the different varieties. How do all those varieties come about? Through genetic shuffling and occasional loss of functional genes. Because as you shuffle and lose genes, you come up with a lot of varieties of different arrangements and combinations of existing genes, but all of those genes started off in the parent population.
Well, in fact, varieties can come about when new genes are created de novo. In fact, a Google Scholar search for evolution of de novo gene yields 737,000 results, with titles such as protogenes and de novo gene birth, genes from scratch, the evolutionary fate of de novo genes, de novo origination of a new protein coding gene in Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Hey, that's brewer's yeast. That's how we get beer. The role of de novo protein coding genes in eukaryotic evolutionary innovation. Evolution dynamics of de novo gene emergence. So, Wrong. You're wrong.
So that's the creationary orchard. When we are looking at the possible following generation, so we take generation 1, which is this worm here. We got this blue worm here represents generation 1. The following generations can be extinction, his descendants all die, or his descendants are all exactly the same, or his descendants are different worms because they are a different arrangement of the existing genes. You don't have to make new genes to get new variations. All of those hundreds of different pet shop dogs did not result from the creation of new genetic information. It's from the shuffling and loss of the genes that started. So this one right here is the only change which is evolutionary.
Wow, starting off really badly with this one. Okay, so earlier I wasn't sure if you were actually meaning worms to mean like modern earthworms, or if you were just kind of thinking about them in the sort of broad sense that just about anything without defined limbs that's kind of longer than it is wide or tall is sort of a worm. But no, you just drew earthworms. Just to further push home that straw man, because yeah, that's definitely what evolution says. But all of those changes, except possibly the one where the worm stays the same, and extinction, are in fact evolution, because at a minimum, evolution is any change in allele frequency in a population over time, and a difference in the prevalent color, assuming the color is genetically coded for and not, say, determined by diet like it is in flamingos, is going to be the result of a change in allele frequency over time. Further, worms don't become non-worms. If worm were a clade, and anything that came from it would still be a worm. And if we assume that worm is basically just bilaterian, which, let's be honest, if we're going to use the word worm in a taxonomic sense, it's really the only taxon that really goes there, then fish are in fact still bilaterians. In fact, the earliest fish, like we've already seen, were pretty worm-like in the colloquial sense. But still, nothing gave rise to something other than what it already was. It gave rise to what it already was, plus something.
The non-biblical creation evolutionary model is just this one. All right, that is distinct. All this stuff over here, that's all part of the orchard. Let me back up to the orchard here. So here, we start off with all of these different kinds being created, and then one pair of each kind on the ark for the most part. And then how you get all this variation is genetic shuffling, dissemination, genetic drift, as they move from one place to the other, migration. You know, all of that's explained by all of those things. The only thing you don't see here is the accumulation of new genetic information for new structures, functions, and behaviors. That is the purely evolutionary difference.
Well, that's a good thing, I guess, for evolution, that we have in fact seen animals gain new functions, new behaviors, and even new structures in real time via evolution. One famous example is Podarcus sicula, a lizard, which was originally native to Podkopiste in the South Adriatic Sea, but in 1971, some biologists moved 10 of them, 5 breeding pairs, to Pod Mercado. And guess what? The ones on the new island gained a new head shape and new structures in their intestines that allowed them to more easily digest the plant matter that they were now eating in more abundance than their previous insect-heavy diet. These weren't just a differently shaped intestinal structure. These involved cecal valves with muscles that contracted the valves that allowed the plant matter to ferment inside the intestines and then opened after a while to allow waste out. This involved actual nervous system interaction with muscles and the intestine and symbiotic gut flora. This is not a variation that already existed in these lizards. This is a new structure. Alright, this video is already a half an hour long, and I'm going to cut it off here, but I'm not done with this guy, so stay tuned. If you like this video, please hit the like button, share it, and subscribe to my channel. If you really, really like my content, head over to Patreon and join the team that's helping me create all these videos. Be aware that while most benefits only apply after your first billing cycle, Discord and voting benefits apply immediately. Thank you for watching. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
So let's say you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know.